Katharine Hepburn. Born in 1907 to progressive parents, Hepburn grew up in a household that championed free thought over religious doctrine. Her father was a urologist who advocated for public health reform, and her mother was a fierce suffragist. In a time when many families clung to religious tradition, the Hepburn household encouraged intellectual curiosity and self-reliance. This foundation shaped Katharine's worldview, leading her to reject religion entirely. She was never one to mince words, openly declaring in multiple interviews, "I'm an atheist and that's it. I believe there's nothing we can know except that we should be kind to each other." It was a bold stance, especially in an era when Hollywood leaned conservative and public figures were expected to at least pay lip service to faith. But Hepburn never played by the rules. Her belief in personal responsibility and self-determination was evident not just in her personal philosophy, but in the strong, independent women she portrayed on screen. She refused to let societal expectations dictate her choices, whether in her career, her relationships, or her beliefs. Even as Hollywood's moral watchdogs loomed large, she remained steadfast in her atheism, never softening her stance to appease audiences or studio executives. Until her passing in 2003, Hepburn never wavered in her conviction that religion was unnecessary in her life. For her, faith was not a prerequisite for morality, kindness and integrity were. Bruce Lee. Bruce Lee was more than just a martial artist. He was a philosopher, a visionary, and a man who saw no need for divine intervention in shaping his destiny. Born in San Francisco in the early 1940s and raised in Hong Kong, Lee grew up in a Buddhist household, but religion was never a defining force in his life. Instead, he placed his faith in discipline, self-improvement, and the relentless pursuit of personal mastery. He didn't reject spirituality outright, but he saw it as an internal journey rather than something dictated by religious doctrine. His philosophy was rooted in practicality. He believed human potential wasn't limited by fate or supernatural forces, but by one's own willingness to push past limitations. This mindset fueled his meteoric rise in Hollywood and martial arts, where he shattered stereotypes and revolutionized action cinema. Even as he became a global icon, he never credited a higher power for his success. Instead, he famously said, "Do not pray for an easy life. Pray for the strength to endure a difficult one." His legacy continues to inspire, proving that meaning and purpose can be forged through sheer will and self-determination, without the need for divine guidance. James Baldwin. James Baldwin's journey from devout preacher to outspoken atheist wasn't just personal, it was political. Raised in Harlem during the early 20th century, Baldwin grew up in a deeply religious household, where faith was more than belief, it was survival. By his teenage years, he had fully embraced Pentecostalism, even becoming a fiery young preacher. But the more he read, the more he questioned. The contradictions in religious teachings, the hypocrisy he saw in the church, and the way Christianity had been used to justify racism and oppression all gnawed at him. By the time he reached adulthood, Baldwin had abandoned Christianity altogether, seeing it as a system designed to control rather than liberate. His atheism wasn't just a rejection of God, it was a rejection of the structures that had long kept black communities in chains. Yet despite turning away from religion, Baldwin remained deeply spiritual in his own way. His writing, from Go Tell It on the Mountain to The Fire Next Time, wrestled with faith, doubt, and the search for meaning. He believed in the power of human connection, in justice, and the idea that people, not divine forces, were responsible for shaping the world. And in a time when speaking against religion was nearly unthinkable, Baldwin did it with unflinching honesty, proving that doubt could be just as powerful as belief. Marlene Dietrich. Born in Germany in the early 1900s, Dietrich was raised in a strict Catholic household, but faith never quite took hold of her. As she grew older, she rejected religious teachings entirely, seeing them as restrictive rather than enlightening. But it was World War II that truly cemented her disbelief. Witnessing the devastation of the Holocaust firsthand, she became convinced that no benevolent God could allow such horrors to unfold. Unlike many of her contemporaries, she didn't keep her views quiet. She openly criticized religious institutions, arguing that they too often enabled war and suffering rather than preventing it. Yet despite her lack of belief, Dietrich was deeply compassionate. She dedicated much of her life to humanitarian efforts, working tirelessly to support refugees and soldiers alike. Until her death in the early 1990s, she remained unwavering in her atheism, never reconciling with the faith of her childhood. In an era where public figures were expected to conform, Dietrich defied expectations, both as an artist and as a woman who refused to believe in anything but her own convictions. Frank Zappa. Frank Zappa never shied away from controversy, and when it came to religion, he was downright fearless. Born in the year 1940, he was raised in a Catholic household, but from an early age, he questioned the rigid doctrines surrounding him. As he grew older, his skepticism hardened into outright rejection. To Zappa, organized religion wasn't just flawed. It was a tool of control, a system designed to suppress free thought and individuality. His music became a battleground where he took aim at what he saw as hypocrisy and manipulation, lacing his lyrics with biting satire and irreverent humor. Songs like Dumb All Over and Heavenly Bank Account were scathing critiques of religious institutions, calling out corruption and blind faith. But it wasn't just in his music. Zappa was outspoken in interviews, unafraid to challenge societal norms. He believed that critical thinking was the antidote to what he saw as religion's grip on the masses, and he used his platform to push back against dogma at every turn. Even as his views stirred controversy, he remained unapologetic, never backing down from his convictions. Until his death in 1993, his atheism was not just a belief, it was a defining part of his identity, woven into his art, his activism, and his relentless pursuit of truth. Ayn Rand. Ayn Rand was never one to tiptoe around her beliefs. Born in Russia in the early 1900s and raised in a Jewish household, she rejected religion at a young age. The chaos of the Russian Revolution only reinforced her conviction that faith was irrational and that reason was the only true path. By the time she arrived in the United States in the 1920s, she had already formulated the foundations of objectivism, a philosophy that placed logic and individualism above all else. To Rand, religion was not just misguided, it was an obstacle to human progress. She saw morality as something that should be dictated by reason, not divine command. This belief bled into her writing, particularly in Atlas Shrugged, where her protagonists embodied her atheistic worldview, unyielding, self-reliant, and dismissive of anything that could not be proven. Despite facing intense criticism from both religious and academic circles, Rand never wavered. She spent her life advocating for a world free from spiritual influence, where human achievement was the highest virtue. To this day, her work remains polarizing, embraced by some as a manifesto for personal freedom and condemned by others as a cold dismissal of human compassion. Stanley Kubrick. Stanley Kubrick was a man obsessed with detail, with precision, and with the vast and different universe. Born in the late 1920s to a Jewish family in the Bronx, he was surrounded by tradition but never embraced faith. Religion to him was an inadequate answer to the grand questions of existence. Instead, he turned to science, philosophy, and the cold logic of human discovery. His films reflected this skepticism, stripping away divine intervention and replacing it with existential dread and cosmic mystery. Nowhere was this more apparent than in 2001, A Space Odyssey, a film that charted humanity's evolution not through the hand of a deity, but through the silent, enigmatic force of an alien intelligence. Kubrick didn't see a god guiding mankind. He saw randomness, survival, and the terrifying vastness of space. Until his death in the late 1990s, he remained unconvinced by religion, believing that truth was something to be uncovered, not worshipped. Greta Garbo. Greta Garbo was a mystery wrapped in elegance, a woman who captivated the world with her silent performances and then disappeared from the spotlight just as mysteriously. Born in Sweden in the early 1900s, she was raised in a strict Lutheran household, but faith never took root in her. Hollywood only deepened her skepticism. As she ascended to international stardom in the 1920s and 30s, she became increasingly disillusioned with the idea of a higher power. She once admitted that religion brought her no comfort, preferring solitude and deep introspection over prayer or doctrine. Garbo was known for her philosophical musings, often contemplating life's meaning without invoking religion. Even as she withdrew from public life, her beliefs, or lack thereof, remained steadfast. Until her passing in 1990, she never reconciled with the faith of her childhood, staying true to her conviction that the answers to life's great questions lay within, not above. Charlie Chaplin. Charlie Chaplin was more than just the man with the bowler hat and cane. He was a storyteller who used comedy to challenge the status quo. Born in the late 1800s into crushing poverty in London, Chaplin saw religion not as a source of comfort, but as an institution that often failed the people who needed it most. His mother, a struggling actress, suffered from mental illness, and his father abandoned the family, leaving young Chaplin to fend for himself in workhouses and charity homes, many of them run by religious organizations. But instead of finding salvation, he saw hypocrisy, preachers who spoke of compassion yet turned their backs on the poor. That disillusionment shaped his worldview for life. As his star rose in Hollywood, Chaplin never shied away from critiquing religious institutions. His films, often laced with satire, poked fun at the self-righteousness of those in power. In Monsieur Verdoux, he questioned moral absolutism, while The Pilgrim openly mocked religious authority figures. His refusal to conform made him a target. During the height of McCarthyism, he was accused of being a communist and an atheist, two labels that, at the time, could end a career. But Chaplin remained unapologetic. He never publicly declared himself an atheist, but his writings and interviews made it clear. He rejected organized religion and placed his faith in humanity instead. Despite the controversies, Chaplin lived by his own moral code, one rooted in humanism. He believed in kindness and laughter and the idea that people could be good without the fear of divine punishment. In his later years, he softened toward spirituality, but never embraced religion. When he passed away in the late 1970s, he left behind a legacy not just of cinematic brilliance, but of defiance, proof that one could challenge tradition and still leave an indelible mark on the world. Jean-Paul Sartre. Jean-Paul Sartre was born into a world of faith, but he didn't stay there for long. Raised in a Catholic household in the early 1900s, he was expected to follow the religious traditions of his family. But Sartre was never one to accept a preordained path. As a young man, he abandoned religion entirely, drawn instead to philosophy, where he would carve out his own existentialist beliefs. He rejected the notion of a divine being, arguing that humans are not given meaning by a higher power, but must create it for themselves. This idea became the foundation of his work, culminating in his famous declaration, "Man is condemned to be free." To him, this wasn't a blessing, it was a burden. Without a god to dictate morality, every individual bore the full weight of their choices. His atheism wasn't just a private belief, it shaped his novels, plays, and political activism. His work sparked controversy, with critics accusing him of promoting nihilism, while others saw his philosophy as a call to personal responsibility. Regardless of the debate, Sartre's influence was undeniable. In a century dominated by existential crises, he provided a framework for understanding life without divine guidance. His ideas reshaped modern thought, proving that even in the absence of God, meaning could still be forged by those willing to take the responsibility. Diego Rivera. Diego Rivera's murals were larger than life, not just in scale but in the sheer audacity of their message. Born in the late 1800s into a Catholic household, Rivera quickly rejected the faith of his upbringing. Instead, he embraced Marxism, seeing religion as a tool of control rather than a source of salvation. His art reflected this belief, bold, unflinching, and often deeply controversial. Nowhere was this more apparent than in his infamous Rockefeller Center mural. Commissioned in the early 1930s, Rivera painted a grand fresco celebrating industry and progress, but he also included something that sent shockwaves through the establishment, a towering image of Vladimir Lenin. The mural was swiftly destroyed, its political and atheistic themes deemed too radical for public display. Rivera, however, remained undeterred. Until his death in the late 1950s, he held firm in his conviction that art should reflect reality, not religious idealism. For Rivera, the divine wasn't found in churches or scripture. It was in the struggle of the working class, in the hands of laborers, and in the fight for justice. His legacy endures, a testament to the power of art to challenge, provoke, and above all, to tell the truth. Howard Hawks. Howard Hawks was a man who built his own world, both on and off the screen. Born in the late 1800s into a Christian household, he was surrounded by faith, but never embraced it. Unlike many of his contemporaries in Hollywood's golden age, Hawks saw no divine hand guiding his life or his work. Instead, he believed in people, in their grit, their intelligence, and their ability to carve out their own destinies. His films reflected this philosophy, packed with characters who relied on their own wits rather than prayers. Whether it was the unshakable pilots in Only Angels Have Wings or the hardened cowboys in Red River, his protagonists didn't look to the heavens for answers. They solved their own problems, faced their own demons, and survived on sheer willpower. Hawks once stated in an interview that he had never seen any evidence of God. To him, life wasn't about waiting for salvation. It was about action, about resilience. This perspective was especially striking in an era when Hollywood often leaned into religious themes, with biblical epics and moralistic tales dominating the box office. Yet Hawks never wavered. He was uninterested in grand spiritual narratives, choosing instead to tell stories about human ingenuity and strength. Some saw this as a bold move, while others may have found it unconventional. Either way, it set him apart. Until his final days in the late 1970s, Hawks remained a skeptic, He never sought comfort in faith, never turned to religion for meaning. To him, the world was what people made of it. And through his films, he left behind a legacy that celebrated the power of human determination over divine intervention. Simone de Beauvoir. Simone de Beauvoir was born in the early 1900s into a devout Catholic family in France, where religion dictated the rhythms of daily life. But by her teenage years, she had already begun to question the faith that had been instilled in her. The turning point? A realization that the moral framework of Catholicism was less about spiritual enlightenment and more about control, especially over women. As she delved into philosophy, she found herself drawn to the existentialist ideas of Jean-Paul Sartre, who, like her, rejected the notion of a divine being. For her, religion wasn't just a comforting illusion, it was a mechanism that reinforced patriarchal dominance. She laid this bare in her groundbreaking book, The Second Sex, where she argued that religious doctrine had long been used to keep women submissive, obedient, and dependent. Her words were incendiary, challenging centuries of dogma that had shaped societal norms, and she never wavered. Until her passing in the mid-1980s, she remained a staunch atheist, advocating for a world where reason and equality replaced religious tradition. In an era where questioning faith was still considered radical, de Beauvoir stood firm, shattering conventions and reshaping feminist thought forever. If you've enjoyed this video, please leave a like and comment. Also consider subscribing and hitting the notification bell to get notified of our new videos each week. Thanks for watching.